If you stay until 10 seconds in, deep inside Russia's Ural Mountains, buried under 1,000 feet of solid granite, there's a bunker that was built for one purpose: to end civilization as we know it, even if everyone who built it is already dead. And right now, as you watch this video, it's operational. Before we dive into this nightmare, hit subscribe because we explore the world's most terrifying military facilities, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. This isn't science fiction. This isn't a movie plot. This is Kosvinsky Kamen, and if you've never heard of it, that's exactly what Russia wants. But here's what keeps American generals awake at night. Even if Russia's entire leadership were vaporized in a first strike, even if Moscow became a radioactive crater, even if every Russian commander were dead, this facility could still launch every single nuclear weapon in Russia's arsenal, automatically. We're talking about a doomsday machine that doesn't need human permission to end the world. And you're about to discover why this single installation might be the most dangerous place on Earth. Picture this. It's 1979. The Cold War is at its absolute peak. Soviet leaders are terrified, not of American missiles, but of something far more insidious. American technology is advancing so rapidly that Soviet intelligence believes the United States could execute what they call a decapitation strike. Imagine this scenario. American stealth bombers, B-2s, that Soviet radar can't detect, combined with incredibly precise ICBMs, could theoretically eliminate Soviet leadership in minutes. The Kremlin could be dust. The Ministry of Defense could be obliterated. Every command center in Moscow could be reduced to smoking rubble before a single Soviet general could even reach for the phone to order retaliation. This wasn't paranoia. This was the nightmare scenario that haunted every Soviet military planner throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. Now here's the terrifying question that Soviet generals ask themselves in their most secret meetings. If we're all dead in the first 5 minutes of World War III, how do we make sure America dies too? How do you guarantee mutual assured destruction when you might not survive long enough to give the order? The answer they came up with would be called perimeter by the Russians and dead hand by the West, and it required a fortress that could survive the apocalypse itself. They needed a location that met impossible criteria. It had to be deep enough that American bunker-buster nukes couldn't touch it. It had to be in granite, the hardest rock formation nature provides. It had to be remote enough that it wouldn't be a priority target in the opening salvos of nuclear war. And critically, it had to be positioned where it could communicate with every nuclear missile silo, every nuclear submarine, every strategic bomber in the entire Soviet arsenal, even through the electromagnetic chaos of multiple nuclear detonations. After months of geological surveys, seismic studies, and strategic analysis, they found their answer in the northern Ural Mountains, 850 miles east of Moscow, a mountain called Kosvinsky Kamen. Now let me paint you a picture of this place because this isn't your typical military base. Kosvinsky Kamen rises 1,519 meters above sea level. Its peak is completely barren, just exposed rock and small lakes fed by melting snow. The slopes are covered in dense coniferous forests mixed with birch trees up to about 3,000 feet elevation. Above that, it's pure alpine tundra. Nothing lives up there. The winds are brutal. The temperature can drop to minus 40 degrees Celsius in winter. It's one of the most isolated, inhospitable locations in Russia, perfect for a doomsday bunker. The mountain itself is composed of pyroxenites and dunites, incredibly dense rock formations from the Paleozoic era, over 250 million years old. This isn't sedimentary rock that water can erode or that missiles can shatter relatively easily. This is some of the hardest geological material on the planet, harder than most steel, formed under immense pressure deep in the Earth's mantle. Construction began in the late 1970s under conditions of absolute secrecy that would make today's classified programs look like open books. Imagine the logistics of this operation. They had to hollow out chambers inside solid granite over 1,000 feet beneath the summit. They had to do this without anyone noticing. No visible construction equipment, no obvious excavation, no satellite detectable activity that would alert American intelligence satellites that were constantly photographing Soviet territory. How do you move thousands of tons of rock without anyone seeing? How do you bring in the specialized equipment needed to carve through granite without leaving traces?
The answer involves some of the most impressive engineering in Soviet history. They used underground mining techniques perfected in Soviet coal and uranium mines, creating access tunnels from multiple directions. Workers lived on site in closed military cities, a uniquely Soviet institution that we need to understand to grasp the scale of what was happening. These weren't just construction camps. They were entire communities that existed solely to support this construction project, and none of them could tell their families what they were building. Let me explain what closed cities actually were, because understanding them is key to understanding how the Soviets built something this massive in secret.
Closed cities, called zato in Russian, Zakrytye administrativno-territorialne образование, which translates to closed administrative territorial formations, were settlements where travel and residency were completely restricted. These cities were built during the Cold War to support sensitive military and nuclear facilities. They were surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. They had their own internal passports. They didn't appear on maps. If you tried to find them on a Soviet-era map, you'd see nothing but forest or maybe a small, insignificant village name. The real city, with tens of thousands of people, factories, schools, hospitals, simply didn't exist on paper. By the time Kosvinsky Kamen was being constructed, there were already dozens of these closed cities across the Soviet Union. Cities like Arzamas-16, now called Sarov, where Soviet nuclear weapons were designed. Cities like Chelyabinsk-65, now called Ozersk, where plutonium was produced. Cities like Krasnoyarsk-26, where entire nuclear reactors were built underground. These closed cities housed some of the most brilliant scientists in the Soviet Union, alongside the engineers, construction workers, and military personnel needed to support them. And these people lived their entire lives in cities that officially didn't exist. The closed cities supporting Kosvinsky Kamen's construction were located in the surrounding region of the northern Urals. Workers were recruited from across the Soviet Union, offered higher salaries, better housing, superior food rations compared to normal Soviet cities. But there was a catch. Once you moved to a closed city, your life became classified. You couldn't tell anyone outside the city where you lived or what you did. When you wrote letters to family, you used a postal code that referenced a nearby larger city, never the actual closed city. When you visited family on approved leave, you couldn't discuss your work. If you violated these rules, you faced criminal prosecution, possibly years into labor camp. Security was so tight that workers were rotated frequently, so no individual would understand the full scope of the Kosvinsky Kamen project. A team might excavate tunnels for 6 months, then be transferred to a different project hundreds of miles away. Another team would take over, knowing nothing about what came before or what would come after. This compartmentalization meant that even the workers themselves didn't fully understand what they were building. They knew they were excavating chambers in granite. They knew it was for the military, but the strategic purpose, the role it would play in nuclear war planning, that was known only to a select few at the highest levels of Soviet command. The excavation itself was a monumental task. Granite is incredibly hard. You can't just dig through it with conventional equipment. The Soviets used a combination of techniques.
First, they drilled deep holes into the granite using specialized diamond-tipped drill bits. Then they packed these holes with explosives, carefully calculated to fracture the granite in specific patterns. After each controlled explosion, they'd remove the broken rock, then drill again, place more explosives, and continue the process. It took years. Hundreds of thousands of tons of granite were removed, one explosion at a time, one truckload at a time, moving through underground tunnels so American satellites wouldn't see the excavation on the surface. But here's what makes your blood run cold. This wasn't just a bunker for Soviet leaders to hide in during nuclear war. That would be simple, terrifying, but simple. No, Kosvinsky Kamen was built to house something far more disturbing. The heart of the perimeter system, the dead hand, the doomsday machine that could function without humans. Let me explain how this nightmare works, because understanding this system will help you grasp why American war planners have been obsessed with Kosvinsky Kamen for decades. The perimeter system, which became operational in 1985, was designed as the ultimate insurance policy against decapitation.
Here's the logic, cold and rational and absolutely terrifying. If Soviet sensors detect multiple nuclear detonations on Soviet soil, and if communications with Central Command in Moscow go dead, and if a certain amount of time passes with no orders from leadership, Then the system assumes the worst. It assumes Soviet leadership has been destroyed, and that's when it activates. Once activated, Perimeter doesn't immediately launch every nuke. That would be too simple and too dangerous, too prone to accidents. Instead, it transfers launch authority to a small crew of duty officers deep inside Kosvinsky Kamen. These aren't generals, these aren't political leaders, these aren't members of the Politburo. These are mid-level officers, possibly as low as colonels or even lieutenant colonels, sitting in a bunker that can survive direct nuclear hits. And here's the key. They have pre-delegated authority to launch. If they verify through their sensors that nuclear war has begun, if they confirm that communications with Moscow are severed, if they determine that Soviet leadership has been eliminated, they can give the order. Just a handful of people surviving in a granite tomb under a mountain in the Urals can launch every missile Russia has. Think about what this means for a moment. In the Soviet Union, everything required approval from Moscow. Every decision, every order flowed down from the Kremlin. The entire system was built on centralized control.
But Perimeter broke that pattern. It gave launch authority to officers hundreds of miles from Moscow, officers who might never have met the premier, who weren't part of the inner circle of Soviet power. This was revolutionary and dangerous, but Soviet planners believed it was necessary. Because if Moscow was destroyed, if the Kremlin was vaporized, someone had to be able to order retaliation, and that someone was sitting in Kosvinsky Kamen. But it gets worse, much worse, because even this system had a vulnerability. What if the bunker crew is killed too? What if American bunker busters penetrate even Kosvinsky Kamen? What if the duty officers are dead or incapacitated? The Soviets thought of that too. They built redundancy into the system through command rockets. These are special ICBMs stored in ultra-hardened silos, designed to survive when everything else is destroyed. If the duty officers in Kosvinsky Kamen activate them, these rockets don't carry nuclear warheads. Instead, they carry powerful radio transmitters. The rocket launches, flies over the entire territory of Russia following a carefully calculated trajectory, and broadcasts encrypted launch codes on multiple frequencies simultaneously. Every surviving missile silo, every nuclear submarine at sea, every mobile launcher in the forests receives the signal. It's a signal that means one thing: fire everything. No human authorization needed at the launch sites.
The command rocket sends the codes and the missiles fly automatically. The entire Russian nuclear arsenal, over 4,000 strategic warheads, launched in a coordinated strike by a missile broadcasting from above the atmosphere, activated by a crew that might already be dead by the time the command rocket reaches altitude. This is why Kosvinsky Kamen matters, because inside that mountain, protected by 300 meters of solid granite, sits the equipment that can make this happen. Very low-frequency radio transmitters, powerful enough to punch through the electromagnetic interference of nuclear war. Communications arrays that connect to early warning satellites orbiting in space, to seismic sensors buried across Russia's vast territory, to radiation detectors positioned in every major city. Command consoles where duty officers monitor the status of thousands of nuclear weapons in real time. Displays showing which missile silos are operational, which submarines are on patrol, which bomber bases are at alert status, and the activation systems for those command rockets. American intelligence became aware something massive was being built at Kosvinsky Kamen in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Satellite imagery showed unusual construction activity. Strange electromagnetic emissions were detected. Electronic intelligence gathered by specialized aircraft and satellites picked up powerful communications arrays being activated.
Infrared sensors detected heat signatures consistent with large-scale underground power generation. But the scale of what Russia had built didn't become clear until 1996. That's when Jane's Defense Weekly, one of the most respected military analysis publications in the world, reported that Russia had completed a strategic command post at Kosvinsky Kamen. The facility was described as specifically designed to resist American earth-penetrating weapons. It was Russia's equivalent to America's Cheyenne Mountain Complex, but built with 1990s technology and full knowledge of what American bunker busters could do. The report sent shockwaves through the Pentagon. But here's what made American military planners absolutely lose their minds.
Cheyenne Mountain was built during an earlier era when nuclear weapons were less powerful and bunker-busting technology was primitive. Cheyenne Mountain is buried under 2,000 feet of granite, and American planners had always assumed that was sufficient protection for NORAD. But Kosvinsky Kamen was built in the 1990s with full knowledge of advanced American bunker-buster technology. The Russians knew exactly what weapons the Americans had. They knew the yield of American bunker-buster bombs. They knew the penetration depth. They knew the shockwave characteristics. And they designed Kosvinsky to survive them all. A 1997 CIA report obtained by the Washington Times confirmed the nightmare.
According to American intelligence, construction was continuing on what the CIA described as a nuclear survivable strategic command post. The report stated clearly, the command post at Kosvinsky appears to provide the Russians with the means to retaliate against a nuclear attack. Translation for those who don't speak intelligence jargon, even if we destroy Moscow, even if we eliminate Russian leadership, even if we execute a perfect first strike, this bunker gives them a guaranteed second strike capability. Mutual assured destruction isn't just doctrine anymore. It's not just a threat. It's automated. It's hardened. It's buried under a mountain, and it will function even after everything else is destroyed. Let me give you some perspective on how protected this facility is. We're talking about chambers hollowed out of solid granite, not built with concrete, which can crack under pressure and fail catastrophically, not dug into sedimentary rock, which can be shattered with penetrating weapons. This is granite, the same material you see in mountains that have stood for hundreds of millions of years. The main chambers are estimated to be buried under 1,000 feet of this granite. Some estimates, based on the duration of construction and the amount of material excavated, put it even deeper, possibly 1,200 to 1,500 feet.
To understand what this means, consider this. The most powerful bunker-buster weapon in the American arsenal at the time Kosvinsky was completed was the B-53 nuclear bomb. This monster had a yield of 9 megatons. That's 9 million tons of TNT equivalent. It was one of the most powerful weapons ever deployed by the United States. And even a direct hit from a B-53 might not penetrate deep enough to destroy the command center at Kosvinsky. The granite would absorb the initial impact. The shockwave would travel through the rock, but by the time it reached chambers 1,000 feet down, it might not be strong enough to collapse them. The American military establishment went into crisis mode. Target planners at the Pentagon and Strategic Command in Omaha faced a terrible reality. They had a new target on their list that might be impossible to destroy. Every nuclear war plan, every first strike scenario, every strategic calculation had to be revised to account for the fact that Russia now had a facility that could survive American attack and still launch retaliation. Some analysts called Kosvinsky the crown jewel of Russian nuclear command architecture. Others called it an underground mountain fortress. Everyone agreed it changed the strategic balance in fundamental ways. The American response came in 1997, just 1 year after Kosvinsky was declared complete. The timing is too perfect to be coincidence.
The United States deployed a new weapon, the B-61 Mod 11, a nuclear Earth-penetrating bomb. This wasn't designed for standard targets. This was designed specifically to destroy deeply buried, hardened facilities. It has a reinforced casing, possibly with a depleted uranium nose cone to help it punch through rock. It has a delayed action fuse that lets the weapon burrow several meters into the ground before detonating. And it has a 400 kiloton warhead, not as powerful as the B-53, but specifically calculated to create a massive underground shockwave. Here's the insane calculus that American weapons designers worked out. If you detonate a 400 kiloton nuclear warhead after it penetrates just 20 feet into the ground directly above Kosvinsky, the shockwave travels through the rock like a massive earthquake concentrated in one location. The granite that protects the bunker also transmits the shockwave directly to it. Rock is an excellent conductor of shockwaves. The goal isn't to vaporize the bunker. That's impossible. The goal is to create shockwaves powerful enough to crack the granite around the facility, collapse the tunnels, crush the equipment inside, and kill everyone inside through sheer kinetic force. Even if the main chambers survive, if you destroy the access tunnels, if you collapse the ventilation shafts, if you damage the power systems, you've effectively neutralized the facility.
But here's the problem American war planners discovered. Even with the B-6111, destroying Kosvinsky isn't guaranteed. You need a direct hit, within 100 meters of the facility's exact location. And here's the thing. The exact location of the main command center inside the mountain is classified at the highest levels of Russian security. American intelligence has educated guesses based on electromagnetic emissions detected by satellites, based on signals intelligence gathered over decades, based on analysis of construction patterns. But you can't see through 1,000 feet of granite with any satellite. Ground-penetrating radar doesn't work at that depth through that kind of rock. You can't know for sure where the critical systems are buried. Which means you'd need to drop multiple B-6111 bombs across the entire mountain, hoping one gets close enough to the actual command center. And even then, you're not certain of success. You might destroy access tunnels on the western side of the mountain, while the command center is on the eastern side. You might collapse ventilation shafts while the main power systems remain intact. You might kill some of the crew while others survive in separate chambers. The uncertainty is terrifying for American planners because nuclear war planning requires certainty. You need to know that when you attack a target, it will be destroyed. With Kosvinsky, you can't know.
But let's talk about what's actually inside this fortress, because that's what makes Kosvinsky truly terrifying, and what makes it worth spending billions of dollars and decades of construction. According to declassified American intelligence assessments, statements from Russian sources who've spoken anonymously over the years, and analysis by nuclear weapons experts, here's what exists beneath that mountain. First, there's the command center itself. This is a massive complex with multiple levels. Think of it like an underground office building, but designed to survive nuclear war. Estimates suggest it can house several hundred personnel for extended periods, possibly months. There are independent power systems, probably multiple diesel generators with enormous fuel reserves stored in separate underground tanks to prevent a single strike from eliminating all power. There are air filtration systems capable of filtering radioactive fallout, chemical weapons agents, and biological weapons. These systems can operate continuously for months, scrubbing air and maintaining breathable atmosphere even when the surface above is contaminated with lethal levels of radiation. There are artesian wells drilled deep into the mountain, providing fresh water from underground aquifers that can't be contaminated by surface nuclear strikes. There are food stockpiles, probably freeze-dried rations and canned goods, enough to feed the entire crew for at least 6 months, possibly longer.
There are medical facilities with operating rooms, intensive care units, and supplies to treat injuries and illnesses. There are sleeping quarters, recreation areas, everything needed for people to live underground for extended periods. This isn't a temporary shelter where people huddle for a few days and then emerge. This is designed for long-term survival during and after nuclear war, possibly for years if necessary. The communications arrays are what make Kosvinsky strategically critical. The facility contains very low-frequency radio transmitters, VLF systems, that are among the most powerful in Russia. VLF radio has a unique property that makes it invaluable for nuclear command and control. It can penetrate through granite, through soil, through water. It can reach submerged nuclear submarines hundreds of feet below the ocean surface. It can reach mobile missile launchers hidden in dense forests. And critically, VLF signals can propagate even through the ionospheric distortion caused by multiple nuclear explosions. During nuclear war, normal radio communications break down catastrophically. The electromagnetic pulses from nuclear detonations create massive interference across most radio frequencies. High-frequency signals become unreliable or completely blocked. Satellite communications can be disrupted, but VLF can still get through. The signals are low frequency, long wavelength, and they propagate by bouncing between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere.
Nuclear explosions can disrupt this, but VLF signals are robust enough to penetrate through much of the interference. That's why Kosvinsky was built where it was built. The mountain itself acts as a giant antenna for the VLF transmitters. The transmitters are buried inside the mountain, and they use the entire mountain as a transmission medium. The signals propagate through the granite and radiate out from the mountain in all directions. These signals can reach across all of Russia, over 11 time zones, and even beyond. They can reach into the Atlantic, where Russian ballistic missile submarines patrol. They can reach into the Pacific. They can reach Russian forces anywhere. There are also multiple redundant communication links, because redundancy is key to survival.
Hardened fiber optic cables running through underground tunnels connect Kosvinsky to other command centers, to early warning radar sites, to other bunkers. These cables are buried deep underground, sometimes hundreds of feet down, making them extremely difficult to cut with conventional or even nuclear strikes. Satellite uplinks can be deployed rapidly from hidden antennas that emerge from the mountain if needed. Backup radio systems operating across multiple frequency ranges provide alternatives if one system fails. The facility was designed so that losing any single communications method, or even several methods, wouldn't prevent it from functioning. And then there's the equipment that connects to the perimeter system itself. This is what makes Kosvinsky more than just a survivable command post. This is what makes it a doomsday facility. Consoles where duty officers monitor the status of Russia's entire nuclear arsenal in real time. Displays showing which missile silos are operational, which ones have been destroyed, which ones are offline for maintenance. Status boards showing which submarines are on patrol, where they're located, whether they're at alert status or stand-down. Information about which bomber bases have aircraft ready to launch, which ones are under attack, which ones are still operational. Sensor feeds from seismic detectors that can identify nuclear explosions anywhere in Russia. These seismic sensors are extremely sensitive. They can detect the unique seismic signature of a nuclear explosion, which is different from an earthquake or a conventional explosion. They can estimate the yield of the weapon, determine the location of the detonation, and feed this data to Kosvinsky in real time. Radiation monitors positioned across the country, feeding data continuously, measuring radiation levels and detecting the presence of radioactive fallout from nuclear strikes. Air pressure sensors that can detect the overpressure wave from nuclear detonations.
Optical sensors, cameras, and light detectors looking for the characteristic flash of nuclear weapons, the double flash that occurs when a nuclear weapon detonates, caused by the initial fireball and then the superheated air mass expanding. All of this data flows into Kosvinsky Kamen constantly, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The duty officers there have a complete picture of Russia's strategic situation at all times. They know if Russia is under attack. They know how many weapons have detonated. They know if Moscow has been destroyed. They know if they're the only command post still functioning. And based on this information, following strict protocols that have been drilled into them through years of training, they make the decision that could end human civilization. Now let's talk about those duty officers, because they're the ones who hold the power to end civilization. Spence Northad, a U.S. military intelligence officer, and later became one of the world's leading experts on nuclear command and control, the crew inside Kosvinsky operates under a strict protocol that's been refined over decades. During normal times, peacetime or periods of low tension, they monitor systems but have no launch authority. They're essentially watchdogs, making sure everything functions correctly, making sure the communications links work, making sure the sensors are operational. They run drills, they practice procedures, but they can't launch anything. That authority remains with the political leadership in Moscow.
But if the system detects indicators of nuclear attack on Russia, the protocol changes dramatically. The system checks a series of conditions, and each condition must be met before proceeding. First, has the perimeter system been activated? This would happen during a severe crisis, when Russian leadership believes war is imminent or inevitable. Activation is a deliberate choice made at the highest levels, probably requiring the president's authorization. It's not automatic. It's a conscious decision that nuclear war might occur and that perimeter needs to be ready to function. Second, do sensors indicate nuclear detonations on Russian territory? The system looks for multiple confirming signatures. It's not enough to see one indication. The system needs to see seismic waves consistent with nuclear explosions. It needs to see radiation spikes. It needs to see pressure waves. It needs to see optical flashes. It needs to see evidence of multiple strikes across different locations, not just one possible false alarm or accident. Third, can the system still communicate with the central command in Moscow? This is critical. Perimeter attempts to contact the Russian General Staff War Room through multiple channels. It sends encrypted messages through fiber optic cables. It tries satellite links. It uses radio. If it receives any response, any indication that Central Command is still functioning, then perimeter does not activate fully. But if it receives no response after a preset time, possibly 15 minutes to an hour depending on the situation, it assumes command has been decapitated. If all three conditions are met, activated status, confirmed nuclear strikes, loss of communication with leadership, then the duty officers in Kosvinsky gain the authority to launch retaliation. They don't need to call Moscow. They can't call Moscow because Moscow no longer exists. They don't need permission from anyone. The authority has been pre-delegated to them by the activation of perimeter. They have the launch codes, they have the communication systems. They can send the order directly to missile silos and submarine bases, or they can activate the command rockets that broadcast launch orders across Russia's entire territory. Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. A small crew of officers, possibly as few as a dozen people, probably around 20 to 30 personnel total including support staff, sitting in a bunker under a mountain, can decide whether human civilization continues or ends. They make this choice based on sensor data and protocol. There's no telephone call to a president because the president is dead. There's no debate among political leaders because the political leaders are dead. There's no consultation with military commanders because the military commanders are dead. It's a purely military decision made by mid-level officers following predetermined procedures.
This is automation of Armageddon. Now, some experts argue that perimeter isn't fully automatic. They point out that humans are still in the loop. The duty officers at Kosvinsky have to make the final call. They could choose not to launch even if protocol says they should. This is technically true, but here's the counter-argument. These officers are trained to follow protocol. They're military personnel who've been selected specifically for this role because they can be trusted to execute orders without hesitation. They've been psychologically screened. They've been indoctrinated into believing that retaliation is not just justified, but necessary to avenge their nation and ensure the enemy pays for their aggression. They've been told repeatedly that if Russia is destroyed, if their families are dead, if their country is gone, the only moral response is to ensure the attackers suffer the same fate. Yes, there are humans in the loop, but they're humans who've been prepared psychologically and trained extensively to push the button when protocol demands it. And we haven't even discussed the command rockets yet in sufficient detail. These deserve special attention because they represent the truly automated aspect of the system, the part that can function with minimal or even no human intervention. The command rockets are a backup to the backup, redundancy upon redundancy.
If the duty officers at Kosvinsky give the launch order, but somehow the normal communications channels are disrupted, if American attacks have severed the hardened fiber optic cables, if electromagnetic interference is worse than expected, if the VLF transmitters are damaged, the command rockets solve the problem. They're a genius and terrifying solution to a complex problem that Soviet strategists identified early on. The problem is this: how do you send launch codes to thousands of weapons scattered across 11 time zones, across the largest country on Earth, when normal communications are destroyed? How do you reach submarines in the Atlantic when your VLF stations might be damaged? How do you contact mobile launchers in Siberian forests when your satellite links are down? The solution: you put a transmitter on a missile and fly it over your entire country, broadcasting continuously. The command rockets are modified ICBMs, specifically UR-100N missiles that have been repurposed for this role. The UR-100N is a reliable, well-tested missile that was originally designed to carry nuclear warheads. But for the command rocket role, the nuclear warheads are removed and replaced with powerful radio transmission equipment. They're stored in ultra-hardened silos that can survive close nuclear strikes, silos that are designed to withstand overpressures that would destroy normal silos.
When launched, they follow a trajectory that takes them over the entire length of Russia from west to east. As they fly at altitudes of several hundred kilometers above the atmosphere where radio propagation is optimal, they broadcast encrypted launch codes on multiple frequencies simultaneously: VLF, high frequency, ultra-high frequency, across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. The signals are designed to be unmistakable and impossible to jam, a specific encryption that only Russian nuclear weapon systems can decode. Every ICBM silo across Russia has receivers tuned to listen for these signals. Every nuclear submarine has equipment that can detect them even while submerged, using trailing wire antennas deployed specifically to receive VLF signals. Every mobile launcher, the road mobile and rail mobile ICBMs that Russia deploys, has antennas that constantly scan for the command rocket transmission. When the signal is received at a missile silo or submarine or mobile launcher, the weapon systems decode it automatically. Computers verify the encryption. They check the authentication codes. If the codes match, if the authentication is correct, if everything validates, the weapons launch. No human at the silo needs to approve. No submarine captain needs to give the order. No mobile launcher crew needs to make a decision. The receipt of the authenticated signal is the authorization.
This means a single command rocket, launched by the duty crew at Kosvinsky, can trigger the launch of thousands of nuclear weapons automatically across Russia's entire territory. The first successful test of this system happened in November 1984. This test is documented in Soviet military records that have since been partially declassified. A command rocket launched from Belarus flew across the entire Soviet Union to Kazakhstan, a distance of thousands of kilometers. Along the way, it transmitted the launch command to a test silo. An actual R-36M ICBM, known to NATO as the SS-18 Satan, one of the most powerful and feared missiles ever built, received the signal and launched. It flew its full range to a test site in Kamchatka and hit its target successfully, demonstrating both that the command rocket could broadcast over intercontinental distances and that the receiving systems could decode the signal and execute automatically. The test proved the concept worked. A single command rocket could trigger the launch of strategic missiles thousands of miles away with no human intervention needed at the launch site, no human authorization, no human decision. The system became operational in 1985 and remains active today. Russia has modernized it over the decades. The current version, called Serena M, uses newer missiles based on the Yars ICBM design, which is more modern and reliable than the old UR-100N.
But the fundamental concept remains exactly the same: automated retaliation triggered by a crew in a bunker, executed by command rockets, resulting in the launch of thousands of nuclear weapons without further human authorization. Now we need to talk about Kosvinsky's sister facility, because Kosvinsky isn't alone. There's another massive underground complex in the southern Ural Mountains called Mount Yamantau, and understanding Yamantau helps us understand the scale of Russia's commitment to survivable nuclear command. Mount Yamantau is the highest peak in the southern Urals, standing at 1,640 meters. The name Yamantau comes from the Bashkir language and translates to evil mountain or bad mountain, which is strangely appropriate given what's been built there. Construction at Yamantau began during the Brezhnev era in the 1970s, around the same time as Kosvinsky. But while Kosvinsky was designed primarily as a command post for the perimeter system, Yamantau appears to be designed as a continuity of government site, a place where Russian leadership can relocate during nuclear war. The complex is absolutely massive. Some estimates suggest it could house up to 60,000 people, though this number is debated. What's certain is that tens of thousands of workers were involved in its construction over decades. The facility is buried under approximately 3,000 feet of quartz rock, making it even more protected than Kosvinsky.
To support construction, the Soviets built not one but two closed cities, settlements called Beloretsk 15 and Beloretsk 16. These settlements were combined in 1995 into a single closed administrative territorial formation called Mezhgorya. Today, about 15,000 people live in Mezhgorya, and even Russian citizens need special permits to enter. The entire area is a no-fly zone. Russian aircraft enforce this restriction. Getting close to the mountain on foot is extremely difficult. The area is patrolled by soldiers, light infantry units called Jaegers, and according to Russian state contracts discovered by investigative journalists, they use advanced DJI Mavic 2 Enterprise Advanced drones equipped with 32-fold zoom and thermal cameras for security patrols. American intelligence became aware of Yamantau in the 1990s when satellite imagery showed massive excavation continuing even after the Soviet Union collapsed. This puzzled American analysts because Russia's economy was in terrible shape. They were having trouble paying their military. They were shutting down bases. Yet construction at Yamantau continued at full pace, suggesting it was an absolute priority. Russian officials were deeply concerned about what Russia was building. Russian officials have given multiple contradictory explanations for Yamantau over the years. The commandant of Beloretsk 15 and Beloretsk 16 initially claimed it was a mining and ore processing complex. Later, he changed his story and said it was an underground warehouse for food and clothing. The commander-in-chief of Russia's strategic rocket forces denied it had any connection to nuclear forces. A former regional communist official alleged it was meant as a shelter for Russian national leadership during nuclear war. Russian newspapers reported it was connected to the dead hand system. The fact that official explanations keep changing tells you the Russians are hiding something significant. What we know from American intelligence is that Yamantau and Kosvinsky form a redundant, distributed system. If one is destroyed, the other can fulfill its functions. They're connected by hardened communications links.
They both have access to the same sensors, the same early warning data, the same launch codes. This redundancy makes the system nearly impossible to defeat. You'd have to destroy both facilities simultaneously, along with any other backup command posts Russia has, and you'd have to do it before they activate the command rockets. The odds of achieving this are effectively zero. Let's talk about the geopolitics of all this, because Kosvinsky Kamen and the perimeter system exist in a larger strategic context that extends to the present day. When the Cold War ended in 1991, many people assumed that the danger of nuclear war had passed. The Soviet Union collapsed, Russia's economy collapsed, democracy seemed to be spreading across the former Soviet territories. There was optimistic talk of a peace dividend. Nuclear arsenals would be reduced, military spending would decrease, tensions would ease. The world would finally move past the nightmare of mutual assured destruction. And for a while, this happened. Both the United States and Russia reduced their nuclear stockpiles significantly under various arms control treaties. The Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START 1, reduced deployed warheads by about half. START 2, though never fully implemented, promised even deeper cuts. But the threat represented by Kosvinsky Kamen never disappeared. Even as relations thawed, even as treaties were signed, even as American and Russian officers began cooperating on various programs, Russia continued to maintain and upgrade its nuclear command and control systems. The strategic rocket forces remained on alert. Kosvinsky Kamen stayed operational. The perimeter system was never deactivated. Because regardless of diplomatic rhetoric, Russian military planners maintained a fundamental assumption. In a crisis, America might still attempt a first strike, and Russia needed the capability to retaliate. This assumption has proven correct in a perverse way. Relations between Russia and the West have deteriorated significantly in recent years. The expansion of NATO toward Russian borders, incorporating former Warsaw Pact countries and former Soviet republics, the wars in Crimea and Ukraine, the economic sanctions imposed on Russia,
The political tensions over Syria, over election interference, over cyber attacks, all of this has revived Cold War-style thinking. And with that thinking comes renewed focus on nuclear strategy and nuclear command and control. In 2011, Russian Strategic Missile Forces General Sergei Karakoyev confirmed to a Russian newspaper that the perimeter system was still active. He stated that the system could destroy the United States in 30 minutes if activated. This wasn't a threat. This was a statement of fact, a reminder to American planners that perimeter remains operational. In 2018, the United States pulled out of the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which had banned medium-range missiles. Russia responded by developing new nuclear weapons, including hypersonic missiles that can evade American defenses. The United States has discussed developing new bunker-buster weapons, possibly even reviving plans for the robust nuclear Earth penetrator that was canceled in the 2000s due to budget constraints and political opposition. In 2020, President Vladimir Putin held a meeting about nuclear command and control infrastructure. The transcript of this meeting was released by the Kremlin, which is unusual because these meetings are normally classified. In the meeting, Putin discussed upgrades and improvements to Russia's strategic command systems. He mentioned that work on a new hardened strategic command post was nearing completion.
Analysts believe he was referring to either major upgrades at Kosvinsky Kamen or new construction at Mount Yamantau, or possibly a completely new facility that hasn't been publicly identified yet. In 2021, Russia conducted a test launch of a Sirena-M command rocket from Plesetsk Cosmodrome. The test was successful. The rocket flew its planned trajectory and broadcast test signals that were received by designated receivers across Russia. The test demonstrated that the command rocket system remains operational and functional, that Russia continues to invest in maintaining this capability, that perimeter is not just an old Cold War relic, but an active, functioning system. There are also indirect indicators that Kosvinsky remains active and important. American military planning documents, some of which have been obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, still list deep underground facilities in Russia as priority targets requiring special weapons. U.S. nuclear stockpiles specifically to target sites like Kosvinsky. If the facility had been abandoned, if it were no longer operational, American war planners wouldn't maintain weapons specifically designed to attack it. The fact that these weapons remain deployed, that they're being upgraded with new guidance systems and improved fusing, suggests that American intelligence assesses Kosvinsky as an active and ongoing threat.
Recent satellite imagery analysis by independent organizations and defense analysts shows ongoing activity at both Kosvinsky and Yamantau.
There are vehicle movements consistent with personnel rotating in and out. There's infrastructure maintenance, road repairs, building renovations. There's power generation consistent with active military facilities, heat signatures visible in infrared satellite imagery. The closed military cities that support these facilities still exist and remain populated. Russia hasn't downgraded the security classification of either site. All of this points to continued operations at the highest levels of importance. But here's what we don't know, and probably can't know without access to classified Russian documents. We don't know the exact location of the critical systems inside Kosvinsky. We don't know how deep the most important chambers are buried. We don't know the full extent of the facility's redundancy. We don't know all of its communications capabilities. We don't know how many personnel are stationed there at any given time. We don't know the exact protocols they follow. Russia has kept these details classified for obvious reasons. The effectiveness of the facility as a deterrent depends partly on uncertainty. American war planners can't be confident they can destroy it, and that uncertainty is itself a form of protection.
As long as America isn't sure it can take out Kosvinsky before it launches retaliation, the facility serves its purpose. Let me paint you one final scenario to drive home why this facility matters so much, why decades after the Cold War ended, this bunker remains critically important. Imagine it's 5 years from now. A major crisis erupts between the United States and Russia. Maybe it's over Ukraine escalating beyond control. Maybe it's over the Baltic states with NATO forces and Russian forces facing off. Maybe it's over Taiwan with Russia supporting China and America intervening. Maybe it's something we can't even predict yet, some new flashpoint we haven't identified. Tensions escalate day by day, hour by hour. Both sides mobilize military forces. Reserves are called up. Nuclear weapons are placed on higher alert status. Bombers are dispersed to auxiliary airfields. Submarines put to sea. Mobile missile launchers move out of their bases and disperse into forests where they're harder to target. At some point, someone makes a catastrophic miscalculation. Maybe an American general believes they can execute a limited strike to achieve a tactical objective without triggering full retaliation. Maybe Russian radar misidentifies a test launch or a satellite launch as an incoming attack. Maybe a cyber attack creates false indicators of war, feeding false data into early warning systems. Maybe a terrorist attack or accident is misinterpreted as the beginning of nuclear war.
Whatever the trigger, nuclear weapons start flying. American ICBMs launch from silos in Montana and North Dakota and Wyoming, 450 Minuteman III missiles carrying single warheads each. Submarine-launched missiles erupt from the Atlantic and Pacific, Ohio-class submarines each carrying 24 Trident II missiles with multiple warheads. Within 30 minutes, thousands of warheads will hit targets across Russia: Moscow, St. Petersburg, military bases, missile silos, command centers. Millions will die in the first hour, tens of millions in the first day. But deep inside Kosvinsky Kamen, the seismic sensors detect the ICBM launches while the missiles are still ascending, still in their boost phase. The facility's optical sensors detect the bright flames of rocket motors firing. The data is processed instantly by computers and displayed on screens in the command center. Radiation monitors begin registering abnormal readings as the first warheads enter the atmosphere and detonate. The duty officers see multiple confirmed indicators of massive nuclear attack. They follow protocol. They attempt to contact Moscow through every available channel. They send encrypted messages through fiber optic cables. They try satellite links. They use radio transmissions on multiple frequencies. No response. The communication links are dead. Moscow is gone, vaporized in the first wave of strikes. They check their protocols carefully because this is the moment they've trained for their entire careers.
Perimeter had been activated 2 days ago when the crisis reached its peak and war seemed inevitable. The activation order came directly from the Kremlin, authenticated with the proper codes. Now the 3 conditions are met: perimeter activated, nuclear strikes confirmed, communications with Central Command severed. More than 30 minutes have passed since the first attempt to contact Moscow. Protocol is absolutely clear. The senior officer present, possibly a colonel named Dmitry or Alexander or Ivan, gives the order. His voice is calm, professional, because he's been trained for this. Activate command rockets. And alarm sounds in ultra-hardened silos across Russia, silos that were designed specifically for the command rockets. Automated systems begin launch sequences. These aren't weapons, they're transmitters, but they're about to trigger the launch of thousands of weapons.
Within 5 minutes, 3 command rockets lift off from separate locations in European Russia, Siberia, and the Far East. They climb into the atmosphere following trajectories that will take them over the entire Russian territory. As they fly, they broadcast encrypted signals on multiple frequencies, VLF, HF, satellite relay. The signals propagate across thousands of miles. In silos across Siberia, Kazakhstan, the Far East, receivers detect the signals. Computers decode the authentication. They verify the encryption keys. Everything checks out. This is a valid launch order.
Launch protocols activate automatically. Missile crews, if they're still alive, if they survived the American strikes on their bases, watch in horror or grim satisfaction as their weapons begin launch sequences without human input. The authenticated command is all the authorization needed. Computer systems that have been waiting for this signal, that have been programmed to respond to it, execute their programming. Blast doors open. Hydraulic systems lift missiles into launch position. Guidance systems activate. Fuel pumps engage. Ignition sequences initiate. In the North Atlantic and Pacific, Russian ballistic missile submarines receive the VLF transmission. They're deep underwater, several hundred feet down, where they're safe from American anti-submarine warfare. Their communications equipment decodes the signal. Within minutes, missiles erupt from the ocean, dozens of them, each carrying multiple warheads. The submarines surface partially, just enough to launch, then dive again. No submarine captain had to give the order. The receipt of the authenticated command signal is the order. The captain's role is simply to verify that the signal was received and decoded correctly, which takes seconds. In forests across Russia, mobile ICBM launchers detect the broadcast. These are massive trucks carrying Topol and Yars missiles, constantly moving to avoid being targeted. Their systems authenticate the codes. Launch crews watch as automated sequences begin.
The launcher vehicles stop, deploy stabilizing jacks, raise the missiles to vertical position. The crews have no authority to override. The system is executing its programming. Within 15 minutes of the command rockets broadcasting, over 1,000 Russian ICBMs and submarine-launched missiles are in flight. Each carries multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, multiple warheads that can hit different targets. The total count exceeds 4,000 nuclear detonations. They're targeted at American cities, military bases, command centers. New York, Washington, Los Angeles, Chicago, Seattle, Houston, Philadelphia, Phoenix, San Antonio, all the major population centers. Strategic bases in Europe, NATO command centers, American forces deployed worldwide. Within 30 minutes of these launches, they begin hitting their targets. The death toll in the first day will exceed 100 million people in the United States alone, probably much higher depending on weather patterns and fallout distribution. The global death toll over the following months from radiation, from supply chain collapse, from famine as agriculture fails, from nuclear winter as smoke from burning cities blocks sunlight, will reach billions. Human civilization as we know it will effectively end. And here's the horrifying detail that should keep you awake at night. This all happened automatically. The duty officers at Kosvinsky Kamen gave the initial order to activate the command rockets. But after that, the system executed without further human input. Missile crews at silos didn't have to choose to launch. Submarine captains didn't have to make the hardest decision of their lives. The authentication codes from the command rockets were sufficient authorization. The weapons launched themselves based on automated systems receiving authenticated signals. This is the nightmare scenario that Kosvinsky Kamen enables. Automated Armageddon. Retaliation that doesn't require surviving leadership. Destruction that proceeds on autopilot once initiated. Now you understand why this place matters, why American military planners still lose sleep over it decades after it was built, why it remains a priority target in every nuclear war plan despite being nearly impossible to destroy, why its existence fundamentally shapes nuclear strategy between the world's two largest nuclear powers. Kosvinsky Kamen isn't just a bunker, it's not just a command post, it's not just a facility. It's the physical embodiment of mutually assured destruction made real, made concrete, made automated. It's humanity's insurance policy that if nuclear war ever starts, nobody survives, nobody wins, everybody dies. And unlike human leaders who might hesitate at the last moment, who might choose mercy, who might step back from the brink even after attacks have begun, this system was designed specifically to function without human judgment in the critical moments. It executes its programming.
It follows its protocols.
it launches the missiles. No mercy, no hesitation, no last-minute reprieve. Just automated, guaranteed, mutual annihilation. So the next time you hear someone talk casually about nuclear deterrence, about mutually assured destruction, about strategic stability, about the nuclear umbrella that supposedly keeps us safe, remember Kosvinsky Kamen. Remember that these aren't just abstract concepts discussed in think tanks and policy papers. They're physical installations carved out of mountains of granite. They're computers programmed to end human civilization. They're missiles waiting in silos for an encrypted signal that will tell them to launch. They're duty officers sitting in underground bunkers right now, at this very moment, monitoring sensors and waiting for a signal they hope never comes. All of this exists right now. It's operational right now. And it will remain operational, buried under mountains of granite, waiting for the signal that will never come unless humanity makes another catastrophic mistake. That's the legacy of the Cold War that we still live with today. That's the reality of nuclear deterrence in the 21st century. And that's why Kosvinsky Kamen, a facility most people have never heard of, a facility that doesn't appear on tourist maps, a facility that Russia barely acknowledges exists, might be the single most dangerous place on planet Earth. Because inside that mountain sits the power to end everything. Not just Russia.
Not just America. Everything. Every city, every civilization, every human achievement, every work of art, every book, every song, every memory. Everything. And it's automated, guaranteed, and waiting. That's Kosvinsky Kamen. That's the dead hand. That's the price of the nuclear age. And that's why you should subscribe to this channel, because we'll continue exploring these terrifying places that shape our world in ways most people never understand. But before we conclude, we need to talk about why systems like Kosvinsky Kamen and Perimeter are so dangerous. And to understand that, we need to look at historical near misses that show what can go wrong. Because the Petrov incident wasn't an isolated case. There have been multiple occasions when the world came within minutes of nuclear war due to false alarms, misunderstandings, and system failures. Each one of these incidents demonstrates why removing humans from nuclear decision-making is so terrifying. Let me tell you about September 26, 1983, the night the world almost ended, in much more detail. The night one man's judgment prevented World War III. This story is absolutely critical to understanding why Kosvinsky Kamen and the Perimeter system represent such an existential threat. It's just after midnight Moscow time, specifically 0014 on September 26th.
Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, a 44-year-old officer in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, is filling in for a sick colleague at Serpukhov 15, a top-secret bunker about 60 kilometers south of Moscow. Petrov is a software engineer by training, someone who helped develop code for the very early warning systems he's now monitoring. This bunker houses the command center for the OKO satellite early warning system. OKO, which means eye in Russian, is the Soviet Union's most advanced early warning network, a constellation of satellites specifically designed to detect the infrared signature of American ICBM launches the moment they occur. Petrov's job tonight is to monitor these satellites and report any indications of attack to his superiors, who will then notify the general staff, who will then inform the political leadership. It's supposed to be a boring job. You watch screens showing data from satellites, you monitor telemetry. Nothing ever happens. It's tedious, but vitally important. But tonight is catastrophically different. Suddenly, without warning, alarms start blaring throughout the command center. Red lights flash. A wall-mounted display illuminates with the word launch in bright red Cyrillic letters. The computer system declares with high reliability that the United States has launched one intercontinental ballistic missile from Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. Petrov's heart starts racing. His palms sweat. This is it.
This is what every Soviet officer has been trained for, but prayed would never happen. But something doesn't feel right. The alarm persists. Then, within just a few minutes, the situation gets worse. The system detects a second missile launch, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth. 5 total ICBMs inbound from the United States, all tracked as heading towards Soviet territory. Estimated impact time, approximately 20 minutes. The protocol is absolutely clear.
Petrov must immediately report this up the chain of command. Every second of delay reduces Soviet reaction time. Now understand the incredibly tense context in which this is happening. This is September 1983, and historians now consider it possibly the most dangerous month of the entire Cold War, more dangerous even than the Cuban Missile Crisis in some ways. Just 3 weeks earlier, on September 1st, Soviet fighter jets had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula. The incident created massive international outrage. President Ronald Reagan gave a television address calling it a massacre and explicitly condemning Soviet aggressors. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire. The rhetoric on both sides reached Cold War heights not seen in years. Earlier that year, in March, Reagan had announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, his plan to build space-based weapons that could shoot down Soviet missiles.
The Soviets saw this as a potential preparation for American first strike capability. If America could shoot down Soviet missiles, mutual assured destruction would no longer protect the USSR. The KGB had actually sent urgent encrypted cables to its intelligence officers stationed in the West, warning them to watch for signs of American preparation for nuclear war. Soviet leader Yuri Andropov, who was elderly and increasingly paranoid, genuinely believed that the United States might be preparing to launch a surprise nuclear attack. The Soviet military had been placed on heightened alert. Nuclear forces were at increased readiness. The psychological atmosphere in Moscow was one of genuine fear that war might be imminent. So when those alarms go off at Serpukhov 15, Petrov is not dealing with just a technical problem. He's operating in an environment where his superiors are primed to believe that American attack is possible, even likely. If he reports this as a real attack, his superiors will almost certainly believe him, and Soviet doctrine is absolutely clear about what happens next. Launch on warning. Don't wait for the American missiles to land. Fire immediately while you still can. Ensure that even if Soviet leadership is killed, even if Moscow is destroyed, American cities will burn too. This is the core principle of mutual assured destruction. Nobody wins, but everybody dies. That deterrent only works if the retaliation is guaranteed and immediate.
Petrov has approximately 10 minutes to make his decision. He's sweating. His mind is racing. Other officers in the bunker are looking at him, waiting for him to pick up the phone and make the call that will start World War III. But something about this doesn't make sense to him. He knows American nuclear strategy. He's studied it. He's been briefed on it countless times. American first strike plans call for overwhelming force. Hundreds of missiles launched simultaneously from land-based silos, from submarines, from bombers. The entire point of a first strike is to destroy as much of the enemy's nuclear arsenal as possible before they can launch, and to eliminate command and control so that whatever survives can't be used effectively. So why would America launch only 5 missiles? It makes absolutely no strategic sense. 5 missiles couldn't destroy the Soviet Union's nuclear capability. They couldn't even take out Moscow's layered air defenses completely. The entire premise of a first strike is massive, overwhelming, coordinated attack. 5 missiles is not that. There's another major problem that Petrov notices. The detection is coming from satellites only. The OCO satellite system is relatively new. It's only been fully operational for a couple of years. Petrov knows from his engineering background that early warning satellites work by detecting the infrared signature of rocket motors during the boost phase of ICBM flight. They're looking for the characteristic heat signature of rocket engines burning. But infrared sensors can be fooled. They can produce false positives. And this system has had glitches before. Nothing this dramatic, but there have been false alarms. Meanwhile, Soviet ground-based radar installations, which are much more reliable and which search for actual physical objects rising above the horizon, are showing absolutely nothing. No radar confirmation whatsoever, just satellite data, and satellites can definitely be fooled. Petrov makes his decision. He picks up the secure phone line to his superiors at the main command center and reports, false alarm, system malfunction, no attack underway. His voice is calm and professional, even though his hands are shaking. If he's wrong about this, if those really are American missiles flying toward the Soviet Union right now, then Soviet cities are going to start exploding in about 15 minutes, and he will have prevented Soviet retaliation. He will have allowed America to destroy the Soviet Union without consequence. The USSR will be annihilated and unable to strike back. They will probably execute him for treason, assuming he even survives the nuclear strikes.
His family will be disgraced. His name will be cursed as the man who let the motherland die. But if he's right, if he reports an attack that isn't actually happening, he could trigger World War III based on false information. Soviet missiles will launch.
American missiles will launch in response. Hundreds of millions of people will die in the first day. Civilization will effectively end, all because of a computer error. The minutes crawl by. They feel like hours. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. No nuclear explosions. No flash of light on the horizon. No mushroom clouds over Soviet cities. No shockwaves. No radiation alarms. Nothing. The satellite's alerts gradually fade from the screens. Petrov was right. It was a false alarm. Later investigation by Soviet engineers determined exactly what happened. A rare and unlucky alignment of sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds over the continental United States had confused the infrared sensors on one of the Oko satellites. The satellite detected what appeared to be the heat signature of multiple missile launches, but it was actually sunlight bouncing off clouds in a very specific way. The satellite's programming hadn't accounted for this possibility. It was a bug in the software, an edge case that the designers hadn't considered, a technical glitch that almost triggered nuclear war and killed hundreds of millions of people. Here's the part of the story that shows how broken the system was. Petrov was never officially rewarded for his decision. Initially, his immediate superior, General Yuri Votintsev, praised him. Votintsev told Petrov that his correct actions would be duly noted. He promised Petrov a commendation, possibly even a medal.
But then something changed. Higher-level Soviet military officials and the influential scientists who had designed the Oko system realized that officially recognizing Petrov would mean officially admitting that the satellite early warning system had nearly caused World War III due to a design flaw. That would be embarrassing. It would damage the reputations of powerful people. It would raise uncomfortable questions about the reliability of Soviet nuclear command and control systems. So they buried the story. They reprimanded Petrov for alleged improper filing of paperwork, claiming he hadn't properly documented the incident in the military duty log. This was a pretext. The real reason was to avoid the embarrassment of admitting the system's failure. Petrov received no commendation, no medal, no promotion, nothing. The official record barely mentions the incident. Petrov continued serving in the military, but eventually retired quietly. For years, almost nobody outside of a small circle of Soviet military officers knew what had happened that night. The story only emerged in the late 1990s when a retired Soviet general, Yuri Votintsev, finally decided to reveal it publicly. Western journalists picked it up. Nuclear weapons analysts and historians realized the world had come far closer to nuclear war than anyone had known. International recognition followed. The United Nations honored Petrov in 2006. He received the World Citizen Award. He was featured in documentaries.
People called him the man who saved the world, but the Russian government never officially acknowledged his actions. The Russian military never gave him the recognition he deserved. He spent his final years living in a small apartment in Fryazino, a town outside Moscow, on a modest pension. He died in May 2017 at age 77. His death wasn't even reported for several months. When it finally emerged, there were tributes from around the world, but Russia itself largely ignored his passing. A man who arguably saved civilization received less recognition from his own country than a mid-level bureaucrat receives at retirement. But here's the absolutely terrifying connection to Kosvinsky Kamen and the perimeter system. The Petrov incident happened in 1983. The perimeter system became operational in 1985, just 2 years later. If perimeter had been operational on the night of September 26, 1983, and if it had been activated due to the extremely high tensions of that period, what would have happened? Let's walk through the scenario. The Oko satellites detect what they believe are missile launches. That's condition 1, confirmed indicators of nuclear attack. Multiple sensors reporting the same thing, exactly what perimeter is designed to respond to. The system would then check communications with Moscow. In the actual incident, communications were working fine. But imagine a slightly different scenario, one that's entirely plausible.
Imagine there's also a communications failure that night. Maybe a cable gets severed. Maybe there's a technical glitch in the satellite link. Maybe there's interference from a solar storm. Now the perimeter system is receiving indicators of nuclear attack, and it can't reach Moscow. That's 2 of its 3 conditions met. If enough time passes without establishing contact, the system assumes Moscow has been destroyed. Condition 3 is met. At that point, perimeter transfers launch authority to the duty officers at Kosvinsky Kamen. Now, think about what happens next. These duty officers are highly trained military personnel. They've been selected specifically for this role. They follow protocols, they execute orders, they don't question the system the way Petrov did. They see sensor data showing 5 American missile launches. They see that communications with Moscow are down. They see that perimeter has been activated. Protocol is absolutely clear. Launch retaliation. Do these duty officers have Petrov's engineering knowledge? Do they know that the satellite system is prone to false alarms? Do they have his strategic insight that 5 missiles makes no sense as a first strike? More importantly, are they willing to disobey protocol and their training to make a judgment call? Or do they follow the procedures they've been drilled on for years and activate the command rockets? If they activate the command rockets, everything happens automatically after that.
The rockets broadcast launch codes. Missile silos receive the authenticated signals. Weapons launch automatically with no further human authorization needed. Within minutes, thousands of nuclear weapons are in flight. The United States detects the launches and responds. American missiles launch. The exchange escalates. Within hours, civilization is effectively over. Hundreds of millions dead in the first day. Billions dead within months from radiation, starvation, and nuclear winter. All of human history, all of human achievement, all of art and music and literature and science and love and laughter, gone, extinguished, ended. Because a satellite mistook sunlight on clouds for missile launches, and an automated system couldn't tell the difference. That's why Kosvinsky Kamen is so terrifying. That's why the perimeter system represents such an existential threat to humanity. It's not designed to replicate Petrov's judgment. It's designed specifically to eliminate the need for judgment like Petrov's. It assumes that if certain conditions are met, retaliation must occur, no questions asked, no room for human reasoning or strategic analysis. And that assumption might be correct in a real nuclear attack scenario. But in a false alarm scenario, in an ambiguous situation where the data is unclear and the indicators might be wrong, automation becomes catastrophically dangerous. Because once the system activates, once those command rockets launch, there's no calling them back.
There's no emergency stop button. There's no last-minute reprieve. The missiles fly, the warheads detonate, and billions of people die because nobody in the chain of command had Petrov's courage or insight to say, wait, something's not right here. Let's think about this before we end the world. This is the legacy of the nuclear age. This is what Kosvinsky Kamen represents. Not safety, not security, not deterrence in any comforting sense, but rather a sword hanging by a thread over all of humanity, waiting for a false alarm, a system glitch, a miscommunication, or a moment of panic to cut that thread and let it fall. And the truly horrifying part is that this system is still active right now, at this very moment. Kosvinsky Kamen is operational. The perimeter system is functional. The sensors are monitoring. The protocols are in place. And if the wrong combination of circumstances occurs, if the sensors report the wrong data, if communications fail at the wrong time, if protocol overrides human judgment, then the automated sequence begins. And when it begins, nobody can stop it. Not the President of Russia, not the President of the United States, not the UN Secretary General, not anyone. The system executes, the missiles launch, and civilization ends. That's the reality we live with every single day. That's the true meaning of nuclear deterrence. And that's why a facility like Kosvinsky Kamen, buried under a mountain where most people will never see it, might be the single most dangerous place on Earth.